API Intersection podcast listeners are invited to sign up for Stoplight and save up to $650. Use the code Intersection10 to get 10% off a new subscription to Stoplight Platform Starter or Pro. Take a look at this episode's description for more details.
I'm Jason Harmon, and this is API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. Welcome back to API Intersection. I would say we're going to do a little something different today because that's what I always end up saying, but I don't know. I think we're going to do something we've done before, but it is different than building APIs. And I think it's like kind of looking at how do you consume lots of APIs that are real similar and make it easier. That is this kind of API aggregation space, so to speak, and some things maybe we can learn from it. So I'm happy to have Gil Feig here today from Merge, one of the co-founders who was kind enough to take his time to spend with us. So thank you for joining, Gil.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And my lovely co-host, Anna, here as always.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So Gil, Merge, I guess, give us the elevator pitch here. What do you guys do so the listeners understand where we're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the notion of an aggregator, and I guess that's a good way to describe us. Essentially, what we do is build unified APIs. So, for example, you are a B2B company. You need to offer integrations with, say, HR platforms to your customers. Merge integrates with 30, 40, 50 HR platforms, unifies them all into a single format, and then provides one API that our customers consume. We started with HR, payroll, and ATS, or applicant tracking systems, have expanded to a lot of other verticals such as, CRM, ticketing, accounting, and planning on tackling all B2B verticals over time.
Got it. So I guess that means your customers are trying to build companies and have lots of these things available for themselves, or is it for their customers?
It is for their customers. So we build APIs that they use to embed within their products to offer integrations to their customers. So let's say a sales ops platform that needs to integrate with Salesforce, but they also, because their customers might not use Salesforce, they might use HubSpot or some other CRM. They don't want to build all of those different CRM integrations. So instead, our customer integrates once with us, and then their customers, no matter which CRM they're using, can choose to integrate with their platform.
Got it. Okay. Integrate all the things.
All the things. You never know what your customer is going to be on. And you're looking at 50, 60, or more platforms. And that's where we come in.
So it's funny. I always think back to because I'm old, I hide the gray hair pretty well, but I think back to late 90s, early 2000s, seeing, some of these products coming out saying, we're going to have this, one definition for how to do this, universal commoditized thing in a given space. And it just sounded so dreamy. And I feel like now there's lots of this stuff all over the place. And sometimes scratch my head and go why is it still like this? Why do we still not have one way of doing things? So I'm curious to get your take from, doing this for a job, trying to build a company around the idea. Why is it still this way?
Yeah, I think first of all, obviously Merge exists because it is that way. But when you look back, there's a lot of reasons. I think one is companies release things over time. So you have a company that built an API 20 years ago when not only the sort of notion of how APIs themselves were built were different, but the industries themselves, the requirements of payroll and HR laws have changed. You have is 2% shareholder now mattering in tax law? And that's now a field that exists in newer HR and payroll systems. So there's a lot of things that cause all these companies to evolve. But because of that, they kind of all end up being pretty different. You also have different philosophies on APIs in general. Companies that want to keep data in-house and not expose it. So they only expose very limited data or expose it in some, very, very difficult to integrate with way. Versus other platforms are all about open ecosystem. We think we can be Salesforce by letting everyone build on top of us and becoming that core system of record. So I could keep going. There's a million reasons, but you ultimately end up with almost, companies that tend to do very similar things, but it's almost like they speak completely different languages.
Yeah.
Developers tend to find themselves like on different camps, right? Some of them like to build from scratch. Some of them like to, pick and choose from the best open source tools or the best APIs that are out there. Who are you talking to? Who are you selling to when you're trying to describe how a unified API will benefit a developer?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we mainly sell to, chief product officers, CTOs, head of product, or, some engineering leader. We do occasionally also do bottoms up to an engineer who's researching, how do I pull employees from Workday? And then they land upon an article from us about that. And they end up diving in and realizing, hey, we don't need just Workday. We need all these platforms. But ultimately, it's a similar problem of a company, especially in B2B, which we target. When they go out and when they set out and say, hey, we need to build integrations, they're not going out and saying, we need to build Workday integration because we have a customer on Workday. They're saying we need to build HR integrations because some of our customers are on Workday and some are on Paylocity and some are on Bamboo HR and Gusto and Namely and Rippling. And, it's just so many of them. And so they start seeing this problem and realizing like this is going to be never ending. And so they make that choice. Do we choose merge or do we choose to build these one by one? And not just merge, but do we choose a unified API? They exist for a lot of different verticals, right? So in e-commerce, you have Rudder, and there's just so many there. And so then, they're kind of looking at the problem, deciding, and they ultimately do first like a technical deep dive. So you will have an engineer dive in. So often conversations do involve both the PM who recognizes the benefits of it, and then the engineer who recognizes the benefits, but also doesn't necessarily trust it right off the bat, wants to make sure it can do everything they need, and wants to dive in and actually deeply understand it.
I mean, do you ever feel like when you look at some of these industry verticals, like, why haven't they just come together and defined one thing? I know I already asked it, but I just can't get off of it when I think about your space. And would that have been, and I know you're totally not objective, right? Like you're trying to build a company around this gap. Do you think like the world would be a better place if some of these verticals would just align on one standard for some of these things?
I think maybe so, but it also, begs the question, like whenever you do something like that, it's an investment. You have to make a lot of changes on your end. And ultimately, what's the benefit to an HR company of agreeing to a standard of HR data transfer? I mean, maybe they could have more companies integrate with them, but ultimately there's also that fear of, hey, our data is now going to get ripped out of our platform and just ported somewhere else because it's much easier to do that if we're all speaking the same language. So I think, there would be benefits mainly for the consumer, but I don't think as many for the actual businesses themselves.
Yeah, no, and I'm being coy too and baiting here in the sense that I think, I feel like our listeners are probably asking themselves this when they look at this kind of stuff. But, older, wiser Jason looks at it and says like, yeah, you're looking at product differentiation. Everybody wants to have a different flavor and a different look. But I guess when, I put yourself in your chair of how to design for 40, 50 different things, like when you put those all together, you either have like a least or greatest common denominator. Do you end up with the sprawling landscape of too many things, or do you end up with it being so lean that it's, questionable usefulness? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for one, we recognize that we have to go deep. It was an evolution for us as a company, but when we started out, we were like, basically what we do, we make a massive spreadsheet of all the platforms, all the models down to a field level. So, you're talking employee, then you have first name, last name, date of birth, everything. And then we go through and we check, is this platform supporting it? Is it minimally supported? That sort of thing. And then we look for dominance. And if it seems like everybody supports something, it's going to be included. If it seems like something's not very supported, but the main platforms, the ones with a huge market share support it, we tend to include that as well. But what do we do if something like Gusto's is 2% shareholder field on the employee is not commonly supported? In that case, we do have a big decision to make, because if we list that as a field that's supported, our developers, customers are going to come in and build on that. They're going to assume that field is going to come through. They're going to build a product that relies on that field coming in. And then we've really misled them when their customers start connecting their platforms and realizing, hey, this is actually only supported for one platform. So in general, we try to go as deep as possible, but we are nuanced about it. We don't cover things that we really think have zero or virtually zero industry support. And then we do have some sort of alternative methods. Anything you can do by building directly, you are able to do with merge and some other unified APIs through other methods of directly accessing the underlying data. But overall, yeah, when it comes to being unified, it is a big decision and big trade-off you have to make.
I mean, I guess the curiosity is you probably see a lot, all the different styles and flavors of API designs. When you guys kind of sat down to look at um, what's our style versus all these myriad of options out there, like how did you decide what good looked like for you?
Yeah. So I think a lot of us came from backgrounds of building APIs, of course, and that's sort of what led us to start Merge. But we obviously, yeah, big decision there. I think there were some that we ruled out, like we weren't going to build a SOAP API, we weren't going to build, some older ones, but there were a few options. Like we could have done RPC, we could have done REST, GraphQL. We were considering a few different ones there. I think RPC, it just wasn't widely supported enough or widely understood enough. We're building something that we wanted the most possible developers to be able to understand. We know everyone's aware of GraphQL and we know that it is up and coming and it is what a lot of people think is the future. But again, it just wasn't something that we viewed as being, widely understood enough, something that would just get people up and running as quickly as possible. So we decided to go with REST. Obviously, we built a lot of our backend infrastructure in a way that it would be easy for us to either convert our API or launch a new version that is GraphQL based if we decide to do that in the future. But really, we're kind of like what we do with the underlying APIs we integrate with. We analyze a lot of things like adoption to understand what's going to be the most successful for our customers.
Yeah, it's I feel like it's boring choice, but it's true. Like I look at these things about once a year. We kind of go look and think about like what are the predominant pattern for sort of externalized APIs, not necessarily microservices or internal stuff. And, for better or worse, it's the state of things. It's like gRPC wasn't really built for that. And GraphQL there's risky stuff in there, right? It's tricky to make it scale. So
exactly, and we thought about that. To me, it's almost like electric cars, right? They're new and cool, and everybody wants one or did want one for a long time. And it was only recently that you had enough charging stations and the infrastructure to support them. And I feel like finally it's a good choice. And I know that GraphQL is going to get there. It's just not quite there yet.
Yeah, fair enough. But even within sort of the, and I don't know, I'm going to get like shot in social media if I just say rest with certainty, this HTTP style API. There's a lot of space for flavor within that. Did, when you guys were doing that early coding, as I'm sure you're involved in, how did you think about, what your kind of models were for, what good looked like, right? Like,
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. I think for us, one big thing was any notion of one-to-one, right? So let's say an employee can have a job title and that doesn't change. It's going to be that forever. That would just live on the employee. So we follow this notion of, making our models as wide as possible, reduce joins, reduce the number of additional requests you need to make. But in situations of one to many, which is really common for us. So unfortunately, job titles do change and people want that history, right? So that's where the employee now has employments that represent for a period of time, they were a manager and then they were a senior manager, and people want that historical data. So we don't want to make someone, though, have to make one API request to us for the employee and then make 10 more for each of their employments or for one for the list of employments, for example. So we really, really loved the idea of this is in the standard REST spec, but the expand parameter, that's a big one we use. So, anything we return back IDs for, you can ask us to expand it as a query param. And instead of an ID, you're going to get back a full object. That's something that actually has been really tough with. I know that you guys are pretty deep in OpenAPI. OpenAPI doesn't have great support for this yet. And while you can represent it in OpenAPI, most of the things that are, like SDK generators and docs generators, they tend to struggle a bit more with types that change depending on your query param. So yeah, that's one of the decisions I would say we chose. Yeah, and then some ordering based ones, page size based ones, a lot of different ones there. But our goal again was when we built integrations with all these different APIs, what did we find to be the easiest for us, the easiest to understand, and also basically what enabled us to build really efficient APIs that didn't require X and API requests to fetch N records, for example.
Yeah. Excuse me. I'm a big fan of that kind of expand pattern that you get what you need. And then if you need more, you just kind of ask for it. I feel like kind of solves for a lot of what people sort of throw GraphQL at everything for. But it can be a tricky engineering problem to actually make that work well. But it sounds like kind of, I wanted to call out another thing that you did here, which is saying that rather than an employee as kind of the noun, the resource, and rather saying that, you then have to go get history. It's like employments. It's like by just pluralizing a verb can make it a noun and a collection of things, right? So it's kind of funny how the linguistics of playing in kind of API design and keeping things as sort of a collection of stuff you can filter on is just, I think it's easy to overlook how straightforward it is when you do it that way.
Yeah, and that's very true, and we're really obsessive about that. We actually released one of our more recent APIs into a beta and realized that unfortunately we had not pluralized one item that needed to be pluralized. Obviously, the consequences of that are quite grave when you have a lot of big customers who are beta onboarded. You have all your SDKs built out, your documentation. You even on your back end changing the names of the tables in the database, all of that. It was a huge mess, and so we have, I would say, pretty strict processes around naming everything now. We're really on top of making sure that things are crystal clear.
Do you put any sort of like automation or anything around that helps you prevent those things?
We do. So we added a linting rule after it happened. But I think unfortunately it was one of those postmortem situations where it won't happen again, but it happened once.
Sure. Yeah. I think anybody that's building APIs has had one of those design slips and have to take it back. It stinks, yep. But I think, if you solve it with automation, it certainly helps prevent the possibility of human mistakes in the future. So is that sort of like code linting level stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, so we do code linting level stuff. We use a few different ones. So we have a normal linter. I think we're all in Python, so we use Black as our linter. We also have been using SemGrep recently, which gives us more complex rules, the ability to also detect security issues, those sorts of things.
Got it. Sorry, I'm intrigued by this one. So anytime someone says they can control the use of language with linting, I'm like, tell me more. So is it just that you're looking for like plural language or like singular language as being kind of the thing to warn on?
Yeah, so essentially we use an ORM. We use the Django built-in ORM for our models. And what it does is essentially it'll look to see, does this model have a one-to-one relationship with another model, or does it have a many-to-one? And if there's a many-to-one, it needs to be plural. There's also instances where the model itself is not a plural name, because that's just a model in our database, but the way it's exposed to our SDKs, so the way that our open API spec gets generated in there, like the endpoint name or other things do need to be pluralized. So there's a few different instances of where we have to do this. But yeah, it is analyzing that. It's going a bit deeper than just like, is it a model, pluralize it or don't.
Very cool. Yeah. Anytime people like catch automation stuff around language, I'm always happy because it's the hard thing.
Yeah, for sure. And we actually are working, more deeply on starting to lint our open API spec, which I know Spectral is a good example that you guys have. It's something that we've been, eyeing and definitely are looking to add probably in the next quarter.
Yeah. And don't worry, I wasn't fishing for a plug there, genuine curiosity. But yeah, it seems like everybody's playing with Spectral these days. It's super cool.
Yeah, very cool.
So you're filling a pretty needful gap, right, in a lot of verticals right now. But what do you think the landscape looks like, 3-5 years from now? What is this going to evolve into, and especially for those verticals you serve?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is API companies have changed a lot over time. And so, you go way back, you have MuleSoft bridging on-prem to cloud, and you have, after that, you have sort of like UiPath, like workflow automation type things. Then you have embedded workflow automation, which would be like Workato and Tray embedded, where essentially the end user can onboard, and then these companies are going in on the back end and, dragging and dropping connections, almost like Zapier in a way. And now you're seeing more of these unified APIs, which are the notion based on this premise that embedding, sort of like these workflow builders is not enough. And companies these days actually, need to build integrations with a ton of platforms that do the same thing. And there's just a lot of grunt work around building those connections again and again and having to go in and drag and drop and drag and drop. And a lot of people have actually moved away from workflow automation and moved back towards coding in-house because it's not solving much of the problem. And so I think that's one of the big reasons you're seeing a lot of unified APIs popping up. For reference, the most well-known unified API is Plaid, where they're bringing together, 50,000, don't quote me on that, but 50,000 banks all in one. You essentially, you go into Robinhood or you go into any app that connects your bank account, and it pops up and asks you to select your bank. That's what it is. They were really, I would say, the originators or the first ones to go mainstream with it. And the value was just so clear that people started seeing this problem in other verticals and started tackling it everywhere. So, I'm seeing them for the most random industries now. But yeah, when it comes to B2B and B2C, transparently, you're just seeing, I think unified APIs are the future for solving this problem in specific, the embedded integration problem.
Yeah, I guess deeper and deeper kind of vertical specialties seems to be the trend, huh?
Yeah. When you look more recently, you're going on these companies, these websites, and they have sometimes 150, 200 integrations, and there's no way they're building them all in house. And they need to offer it to acquire customers because, again, like I mentioned earlier, they don't know which platform their customer is using. But what they do know is they need to offer all of them so that they can serve every customer. And so that's the value of the unified API. It's don't go build 200 integrations. It's maybe build 5 and then you're done building.
Yep. The payment space, which I spent some time in, always makes me itchy around like security and compliance. But the only thing that makes me itchier is when we talk about like HR data and all this very personal data. So feel free to tell me, none of your business, but I'm curious because I'm sure there's plenty of listeners dealing with this kind of data. And I assume you have to cache all this stuff. Is like how, and you're still fairly small as a company, if I'm not mistaken, like how are you tackling some of these like really hard sort of security compliance issues around some of the data that you're using and not have it eat up all of your operational budget?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question and one that I answer almost every day. So happy to dive in there. But before we ever launched, me and my co-founder both came from enterprise software before this. We knew it. We had been through it. I did security reviews probably daily for the past couple of years before starting Merge. And so before we ever launched, before we even onboarded a customer, we had already gotten our SOC 2 Type 2. So we worked on that while we were still building out the product. That meant building a pretty robust security program from the beginning. We're about to get ISO. We're about to get HIPAA. We just need to keep getting them. We're GDPR compliant. These sorts of things are critical. So, we're really on top of it. And that's basically it. We have a lot of options for our customers to also store their data separately. So we offer single tenant. We're working, pretty closely on an on-prem offering over the next probably 6 months to a year. So basically whatever customers need, we're there to do it. We're now able to work with some of the largest companies with really, really intense security programs. And it's because we focus on it heavily.
So I was fishing to see if there was any like tips on interesting platforms that you're using to do all that stuff, or is the answer just as simple as we're good at it? Which, if so, then props for you. But I was hoping to cheat and steal something from you.
Yeah, so we really love Drata. That's a SOC 2 automation platform, as well as other, I guess these days, compliance automation platform. We use them to help get all of our certifications, but also, candidly, they've just made us a more secure organization. They're constantly monitoring our AWS. We'll occasionally get a ping. Hey, looks like you don't have a load balancer and you're required to have that for availability for whatever. We go look, oh, it's some new test server that one of our engineers spun up. But cool, at least we know we're on top of it. We would always be alerted if something like that happened. And then the other piece is it's not just building a robust program and it's not just getting those certifications, but it's also being able to sell your customers on you having that, helping their security team who hasn't been involved in the deal, doesn't really understand what you're doing, making sure that they're comfortable with you as well. And one of the cool things about Drata is they also offer a new product that they just released, and we were pretty early in it. It's called the Trust Center. And what it does is it actually exposes the monitoring that they're doing on a page for us. So we have it up, trust.merge.dev, if anyone wants to just kind of see what a Trust Center looks like. But it lists out, here are all of our security certifications. Here's our company policies. Here are things like, databases encrypted at rest. Here are all these, and it's live monitoring it. So if that was ever disabled, that would turn red on that page right there. And then the other cool piece is a lot of times, you have to send out these security certifications to customers. And they need, you have to get a SOC 2 in place. There's a lot of tracking. And as you grow, you start having these requests every day. It's very difficult to keep track of. And so with Drata, with the Drata Trust Center, we also now have these people coming in, clicking, request, and we'll get an email that says, X customer has requested access to these internal policies that you have, to these certifications. We just click approve, or we send them an NDA and then approve, and then boom, they have access to it. So I would say Drata has been huge on our journey, and there are of course other players in that space as well.
Yeah, that whole kind of trust center space seems like it's exploded. We were early fans of SafeBase, so Stoplight's kind of security posture page, or trust center kind of thing is driven from that. But I feel like we've seen everybody's popped up something with that in the last year or two.
Yeah, and SafeBase, we know that team as well. They're great. Really really sharp team. I believe they're also working with Drata on some things. So both of those companies are definitely great.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I guess, as you think about, this business of calling all the APIs and doing all the things, for folks out there who, maybe aren't, are doing similar things in their day to day, right? And maybe they don't need merge. They're already doing some of this stuff. Like, any words of wisdom on, kind of the things to watch out for, the gotchas and that kind of development work.
Yeah. I think there's a lot here. I think not to plug merge or anything, but always be thinking about the future here. And your company's going to come to you and say, "Hey, we have a customer that needs a Workday integration." Your first question should be, "Is it just Workday, or are we going to have to build others in the future?" Whether or not you want to use a unified API, be thinking about your architecture and how you can do things. Even internally, that's sort of where the idea of merge came, was because internally at our past companies, we had to build our own unified APIs, right? Ingest from different data sources, translate them to a language that we needed internally to use and could be processed by the rest of our system. So I think always be thinking about the future. Another big one is just authentication and thinking about permissions, realizing that your customers are not just going to give you access to every single piece of data that exists within the API. And so being able to handle, what happens if data comes down and is missing, half the things we need, or what happens if data comes down and they've just formatted it completely different from how we did it. And then I think other ones are really a lot of the sustainability and the management, and not necessarily just updating to a changing API, but you have a customer that onboards, they ping your support team, "Hey, the personal email for this employee is missing. What's going on?" Next thing you know, you've created a nightmare for engineering, because engineering now needs to support the support team on everything. So building visibility for your support teams, tracking dashboards, all of those things are another really critical thing to think about.
Very nice. Well, Gil, I really want to thank you for being so open and transparent about how you guys do things. And, certainly wish all the best of luck. It seems like you're growing like crazy and must be doing something right.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the time, and best of luck.
Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.